Evening. I am back for another video, not one of a particular series um, or show, but I'm going to try to discuss something that I've been thinking about for a long time. It's been kind of bothering me, I guess, for a while. You've been warned. And it goes back to a conversation I had, if you want to call it a conversation, an exchange in comments on the ever present Facebook. I guess about 2 years ago, sometime after the Black Panther film came out, and I was commenting on Don McGregor's one of Don McGregor's posts about it. He posts often about the Black Panther because he wrote the Black Panther in the early to mid 70s, and he wrote some of the definitive works like Panther's Rage and Panther versus the Klan. I've been friends with him on Facebook for a few years. We're on a first name basis. He knows who I am, and he's very kind. He quotes me on a lot of his reposts. He likes my analysis of his work, and he's touched by compliments I give him about his work and how much it's meant to me and to probably millions of other people. So he was naturally excited about the film because you had some characters in there like Killmonger and T'Challa's mother, who Don created. Um, and there's even a few scenes and key shots that are right out of some of the old, believe it or not, the comic book was called Jungle Action, starring the Black Panther. I guess that'd be politically incorrect now, um, but yeah, I have the whole run. I don't have all of the individual Panther versus the Klan issues. I have the entire Marvel Epic collection, full color trade, which collects both of those arcs completely. I do have every original issue of Panther's Rage, and we can get into that another time. I have it on Blu-ray. Maybe I'll review it one day. Well, suffice to say, I was shocked and really uh, gobsmacked, as some people say, uh, about Chadwick Boseman and his sudden death from cancer at age like 43, I think. So anyway, um, we were discussing, well, several of these friends of Don's were discussing who created the Black Panther, and of course, the traditional credit is always given as Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Um, so there's been a lot of controversy over the years about uh, what Stan actually did and didn't do creatively at Marvel. I mean, we know what he did editorially. We know how he promoted the company and how he, performed an outreach to Hollywood, which admittedly paid him a lot of money, but didn't really see much fruit other than a few animated series and a couple of short-lived live-action things for many years. None of his initial efforts in Hollywood paid off with a feature film. It wasn't until Marvel was saved from bankruptcy by Toy Biz, I think is what they're called. Avi Arad was in charge of the film division before there was a Marvel Studios, and Stan really didn't have anything much to do with that. I mean, uh, Stan was kind of a professional celebrity, and he was pretty much until he died. He, he enjoyed the unexpected fame of Marvel. It was a hit. It was kind of the scrappy underdog next to the craftier DC comics in the 1960s, and um, nobody was probably more surprised than him. Martin Goodman, the publisher, who was somehow related to Stan, I always forget how because it changes every account I read, but um, either by blood or by marriage, they were related, and Martin Goodman was kind of an asshole, looked on the bottom line at the bottom line and wanted commercial stuff, and he urged Stan in that direction. And when Marvel started becoming successful, he was pushing Stan. And then when Stan stepped aside to become publisher and Roy Thomas became editor in chief in the early 1970s, they were pushing Roy Thomas. But Roy really was the finest editor in chief Marvel ever had, and launched and created or co-created. We're going to go back to that co-created term in a minute. Some very enduring characters who have recently translated into pop culture. Roy created or co-created Luke Cage, Iron Fist. There's some other ones that have been the Vision. I don't know how I could forget that, and Ultron. Yeah, yeah, and lots more stuff. He did the Kree Skrull War, and he did 70 straight issues of Avengers, which are kind of the finest run on Avengers. Really never topped, especially the last few years with John Buscema and Tom Palmer on the art. So and Black Panther was a member of the Avengers then. Roy Thomas was the first guy to write the Black Panther regularly. Don McGregor was the first guy to write him in his own book. So let's get our first straight. Black Panther was the first black superhero in 1966. A few years later, the second black superhero and the first African American superhero, because Black Panther was African, not African American, was the Falcon, who right now, this very minute, even as we speak, is headlining his own TV series, miniseries on Disney Plus. And then Luke Cage, Hero for Hire, was the first black superhero to have his own title, his own book, not under the umbrella of someone else. Panther was the first to have his own regular series in Jungle Action. I think that came slightly before Luke Cage, Hero for Hire. DC didn't get around to, Black Lightning till around 74, 75, I guess. So yeah, Marvel was way out there as far as, breaking those kind of barriers down. And it really all started with Jack Kirby. And like I said earlier, the general credit that is given to the creators as to who created T'Challa, the Black Panther, are Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, in that order. The Kirbys had a lawsuit against Stan Lee and Marvel a number of years ago, and they settled, and it changed the way the credits were done in the films so that anything that Jack Kirby was involved in creating, his name is on it. And even if his name isn't listed first, his name has to be on it. And then not only Stan Lee, but any other co-creator that wasn't originally credited, where Stan Lee got all the credit. So, for instance, in the Ant-Man and the Wasp film, it's created by Stan Lee and I forgot this guy's name. He was a short-term freelancer for Marvel, but he scripted the first Ant-Mans. And Jack Kirby, those three. On Iron Man, I believe, I don't know if it has a credit for Jack Kirby at the beginning of the movies. Thor, I believe, is Stan Lee and Larry Lieber and Jack Kirby. Now, Larry Lieber also co-created Tony Stark, and Jack created Iron Man, with Stan abetting. But those are the ones they have to legally do now. The Avengers, the comic by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, based on. I guess when the Eternals drops, it'll be created by Jack Kirby. I'll be a first, just his name on a feature film. But his name should have been first all along, really. There's always debates back and forth through fandom. It's been going on for years and years. There were controversial interviews with Kirby a few years before he died in the Comics Journal. And then slowly other creators from Marvel from the 1960s and 70s came forward and gave similar accounts. And what the commonality of these accounts was that, they were the writers and Stanley was just the editor, and that Stanley took the credit for writing everything and for creating everything, such as in his books Origins of Marvel Comics, 1975, and Son of Origins, Bring on the Bad Guys, and so on in that series. Um, and that's what I believed growing up. That all came out of Stanley's head. But over the years, Stanley slipped in a lot of ways, and he made certain comments to the media, and he made certain gestures, I guess, of trying to share some credit and do right by some of these people who he was kind of exploiting. And which who Martin Goodman was definitely exploiting all of them. Um, but that kind of put a chink in the armor of the official story, the official narrative, beginning with Origins of Marvel Comics. That I believed as a child. I worshipped Stan Lee. I loved Jack Kirby too, and I knew Jack Kirby created his own series that he wrote, the ones he wrote for DC, and when he came back to Marvel, including Eternals. Um, I enjoyed his work a lot. I went through a period where I was like, yeah, superheroes don't sound realistic in their dialogue like Stan Lee's. Like when Stan Lee was writing them, and I would say things like, why doesn't Jack Kirby go back with Stan Lee on something? Why doesn't Jack Kirby go back to Thor or Fantastic Four when he came back? He did go to Captain America and the Black Panther of the established characters. He asked to do those two characters. And so they actually put all of the current continuity, kind of wrapped it up. Well, in the case of Captain America, wrapped it up. In the case of the Black Panther, they put it all on hold. So Don McGregor's Panther versus the Klan story was not concluded at that time. Jack Kirby just boom started with Black Panther, and he had his own book finally. I guess this was around 78. And so why did he ask for those two characters? And of course, then he created his own rostrum, the Eternals, Machine Man, Devil Dinosaur. To me, all classic books. He did the licensed comic book 2001: A Space Odyssey, which introduced Machine Man, which is one of the greatest origins, I think, of any superhero. One of the saddest stories I read as a kid. 2001 was a great book. Kirby was the perfect guy to, let his imagination run wild. The cosmic milieu from Kubrick's great film. Um, so anyway, I was on this thread a couple of years ago on Don's, and Don has a good friend named Frank Lovis. Lovis is some guy, I don't know what his credits are in the world, and I don't care anymore. And one time I tried to be polite to him. Apparently, they're close friends. I do know that Frank is married to Maitland McDonough, who I have been familiar with for decades now. She wrote the first kind of incisive book on Dario Argento as a filmmaker called Broken Mirrors, Broken Minds. I friended her on Facebook early on. I interacted with her a bit. I thanked her for her bit of inspiration to me. It wasn't as tremendous as, say, Steve Bukowski's with Shock Cinema or Tim Lucas's with Video Watchdog, but she did have some, inspiration to me to write the kind of stuff I was writing when I was getting cult film reviews published in venues such as Shock Cinema and iMagazine and Video Eyeball and Indie File, etc. This was in the, I began doing that in 1996, and I continued it till 2001. I've not been an in print like paper film critic since 2001. So I've done a bit online. I'm dabbling, and I'm doing stuff with these videos. That's an ultimate extension of it. So yeah, Maitland McDonough is married to Frank Lovis, and Frank Lovis is a close friend of Don McGregor's. So anyway, I was kind of to the point where I was getting annoyed with a lot of Frank's comments, you know, about who created what, and um, he just struck me as kind of a smug guy, kind of like a maybe who's someone who was laughed at as a nerd as a kid, and now he feels, he's kind of a know-it-all, and he can kind of, and he's actually, alongside published well-known writers like his wife and Don, and he's, he can kind of bully people now with his knowledge. Yeah, and he attempted to do so to me. Uh, and, because I did rather bluntly comment in a thread, they were talking about Kirby and T'Challa. And, the general idea was giving Don credit for the credit he deserved, the full credit he deserved for what he put into the Black Panther movie. And there's a lot of work by writers like Christopher Priest and a little bit like of Reginald Hudlin in there in the DNA of that film. Tiny bit of Roy Thomas. He's the guy who created the heart-shaped herbs, the first origin of T'Challa in Avengers '87, which I recently sold a very nice copy for $150, which was kind of a steal for that person. I still have an old beat up copy. That's since I was a kid. Um, and Jack Kirby, obviously. The beginning of the Black Panther film is like the beginning of a Jack Kirby comic book from the '70s, and it's very mythological. And what we're dealing with is what's known as Afrofuturism, which has been this long time kind of cultural way of viewing things, and also um, a way of presenting black driven narratives um, that portray African Americans and Africans and blacks as uh, kind of the stars of a utopian future, with great technology. And this is, I can't write a whole essay on Afrofuturism. I've read a bit on it, and I've listened to some music that's associated with it, and it's fascinating to me. It's kind of like the impression I got, and I'm totally willing to be corrected by any viewer who's black about this, or white if they know what they're talking about. But my impression was that the cradle of life, so to speak, began in Africa, began with black humans, and they were the first men, and they had a proud lineage that was stolen from them in the days of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism by the British, and later by Americans. So, in other words, at one time they were kings and queens, and that's become a very common reclaiming place of reclamation. Is that a word? But a reclaiming of that heritage um, in recent years among all kinds of black people, and that are all part of worldwide, part of what they call the black diaspora or diaspora. I never say that word right, but as I understand diaspora, it's basically, you know, blacks were wrenched from Africa and traded all over these places. So they came to America, they went to like Barbados, the Caribbean, Jamaica, the islands, and other countries as well. Those are some of the primary ones, and Haiti, and they were slaves there, and there was a massive sugar trade, and all kinds of natural resources. And then, of course, in the plantations, they, shucked cotton or whatever, because that was a big deal. The cotton gin, was a driving factor of the Industrial Revolution. So I think the Black diaspora is, and some people refer to what happened as the Black Holocaust. And I would go with that. Um, It's something I've been fascinated with since I was a little child when I saw Roots on television. So I learned this slavery stuff pretty early. Um, I was of the Generation X, that kind of came to awareness. I was too young to know about the Black Panthers directly. Though later I learned the Black Panthers, the Black Panther political party, not to do with the comic book. But the comic book hero came first, actually. But the party did not name themselves after the comic book hero. But Stan Lee even got itchy at one point about the Black Panther's name once the Black Panther Party started to gain some kind of political traction and notoriety and infamy, unfortunately. And he's temporarily changed the character's name to Black Leopard, or would primarily refer to him as T'Challa in the story itself. So that was an ill-advised thing, but that was an editorial thing. That could have been a Martin Goodman thing too, for all I know, and not a Stan thing. Um, so I was too young to experience the Black Panthers, and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. I wasn't born during that when that stuff began. I was kind of born at the tail end of that stuff, kind of climaxing. Uh, so anyway, uh, but yeah, I've always been fascinated by, how horrendously uh, the Caucasian race is treated. I guess what was called once the Negro race, but uh, it, it's even this whole race thing is this invention to divide people. It's a politicized, thing. It's a control mechanism like religion and politics, and racism is a heavy cudgel used by religion and politics to oppress others. Inferior races, and I think they fought some fucking world war over this kind of thing, but you wouldn't know it nowadays. I mean, the worm has turned and everything's turned full circle, and the Nazis are pretty much running the show again and calling everybody who disagrees with them commies. So plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Um, if you're not sure what that means, there's a song by Rush you can hear and probably figure it out. The band Rush, not Rush Limbaugh. Burn in Hell, Rush Limbaugh. So I'm kind of circumnavigating the point, but I am getting to it, and I will alight on it very soon, I promise. Bearing all this in mind, Black Panther was a uh, early proponent. His stories in Fantastic Four, by credited to, written by Stan Lee, drawn by Jack Kirby, were examples of Afrofuturism, because Wakanda was on the surface, the guys running around with, tribal wear and carrying spears and giant, masks and helmets. And then underneath, they open it up, and there's like this incredible technology that's far more advanced than anything that America has. So by the time we get to the film, we've really extended when Afrofuturism has weeded its way through the culture in many ways. I mean, one way recently I knew about it, but it was fascinating reading about it in this context. Was the works of George Clinton and music in the 70s. He was kind of a mystic kind of guy. He liked comic book art, and he was part of the Process Church for a while, a kind of cultish, on the fringe, at the same time as like Manson and LaVey kind of cult. And they he was fascinated with all that. So there was this whole mythology that went through the songs and the song titles and the album cover art, mostly by Pedro Bell. And they even did an entire album called Mothership Connection by Parliament. You had two bands, Parliament and Funkadelic, and sometimes it was Parliament Funkadelic. And it was a Parliament album called Mothership Connection, and it's a concept album, and it is Afrofuturism. It is like, and at the time it was made, I read a part of an interview, not when it was made, but I read the interview recently. The interview was conducted around the time it was made by It was either with George Clinton or with Bootsy Collins, one of the major guys in that cluster of bands. And they were like, we decided to try something, with science fiction, with the black guy as the hero, and saving the universe, conquering the universe, whatever, and keeping his culture and the cool things about him and um, his milieu, and pretty cool stuff. Um, so the Black Panther movie is probably the item that has made the most money and been seen by the most people. That is an emblem of Afrofuturism, and vast parts of the movie's production design and some of its costume design. A lot of its costume design is truly Afrofuturism and also authentic African, but the production design and the technology shown is straight out of Jack Kirby's art. It was the second time Kirby's actual drawings had been translated as they were onto the screen, with the exception of two iconic pieces: Captain America's shield, which he designed, Thor's hammer Mjolnir, which he designed. They were made exactly. They look exactly like they were drawn. So they're too iconic to change. But the first movie where really there was a commitment on Marvel Studios' part to make things look like Kirby was Thor Ragnarok. And Taika Waititi made this whole, it's just wonderful. Uh, this planet Sakaar they go to, which in the comic books was not Kirby esque, but Waititi kind of took some of the ideas of the planet from the Planet Hulk storyline and he infused it with Kirby. So you have like designs that came out of like Eternals comic books and Thor comic books, themselves. Uh, Kirby's Asgard itself was kind of a cross between mythology and science fiction in its appearance. And Wakanda is another part of his mythology. And I say his as in Jack Kirby's mythology. So I'm getting to the point. I made a comment in this thread on Don McGregor's page. I said Jack Kirby created T'Challa. It's just that simple. Because I was like thinking, let's cut the bullshit here. It's obvious from the thematics of his work all the way through his oeuvre of work, which was massive and spanned 60 years almost of comic books, 55 years roughly, late 30s to early 90s when he passed away. Um, the themes, I mean, Wakanda was part of this, part of that continuum. You have these themes of these hidden civilizations and these races who are kind of outsiders. They have advanced technology. They're kind of mythological beings who kind of interact with ordinary humans or hide from them, but then will, appear at certain times and are the basis for world mythology. And this has gone through, and also they're different, and they're different in some way or another from humanity. And he carries this theme through X-Men, through the Inhumans, through the Wakandans, through the Eternals, and onward. I guess in his DC stuff, I guess the New Gods would kind of be the fringe beings. But he also had little pockets of them that were kind of weirdos. Like Forever People was a little group of kind of hippie New Gods, and uh, he also created, the boy adventure genre in the 40s with the boy commandos or whatever, and he created Bucky, Captain America's sidekick, and you know uh, the Newsboy Legion for DC with their superhero buddy, the Guardian. He brought that stuff back to DC in the 70s and updated it. Um, as an artist and as a body of work thematically through each company he went through, there is a thread that ties his work together and makes it basically high art, what used to be considered low art. Um, Kirby's in museums now, and he should be. No one draws like him. No one has. I mean, no one naturally draws like him. He's been vastly imitated. Um, but he created these things from his mind, and that's usually the province of a writer, right? And see, comics is a visual medium, so it's dominated by art, um, just like film. That is where you tell the story. That's the engine that drives the story. Is what you see, not what you read. But comics at their best, and one reason I love to read them was because I love to read, but I also loved art, and I liked comics that were kind of verbose sometimes, and so I grew up on stuff like Stan Lee, and I became a fan of writers like Don McGregor, who are they're very wordy, and that's not a knock. They're just very intensive and loquacious and poetic in their use of words to describe that complement the visuals and the graphics. Um, his Black Panther was a great example with various artists, and of course his work on War of the Worlds with P. Craig Russell and artists. Maybe the peak of that for Marvel, or his Marvel work. But he later did other notable works with that kind of synthesis with Gene Colan and Billy Graham and various other artists for various companies over the years. He did Saber and Detectives Incorporated, and he's got a lot of brilliant creations. So even though he didn't create Killraven and Black Panther, he did popularize them, and then he created his own slew of memorable characters. But that's Don's body of work. Don was building on Kirby's concepts in the Black Panther, um, and just as Roy had been doing in Avengers. And you know, like I said, these are stories. These are themes, concept stories. Uh, who creates the character? Someone who draws the character out of thin air. That's a creation. Um, and they name the character, or they collaborate with someone on naming the character, and that's co-create that element. The story itself, the plot, the premise, they come up with that, or they collaborate on it. But if they're left to draw a comic book, what they used to call Marvel style, basically Stan Lee would just farm this stuff out. Stan Lee's official story used to be, we talk about it. No, I'd have an idea, and then I'd talk about it with the artist, and then they'd go off and lay it out because I was too busy to do a breakdown script, and that let them kind of show their talent. And then I would come back and dialogue it and take all the credit as the writer. And as a kid, it didn't seem to bother me, but now it does, because if they came up with the idea, if the original idea came from Stan, that's cool. He's got some creative leeway there, leverage. If they thought of a plot together, okay, that's co-plotting. But then if the artist goes and lays out the entire story just based on that, like what happens in the story, like visually what he shows, this is like a movie with no dialogue. Um, he's written the story. He's telling the story. He's a storyteller. And Kirby is a classic storyteller. He's like the heir to Homer and all this, ages old tradition, Ovid, and all these cats. And um, so he wrote the stories in the ways that are meaningful and that are literal. Um, and then Stan Lee would put his dialogue on top of it. Now I've seen a lot of original art of Kirby's, hundreds of pages of photostats over the years, and Kirby dialogued those stories also. He did captions, he did word balloons on the side with pencil where they could be erased or inked over as needed. And a lot of Stan's stuff is paraphrasing. And then he would add the kind of hip kind of, dialogue and, character tics and speech patterns of certain characters. He would accentuate that. And that was creative and talented, but that made him the writer to himself, and that's what he pushed to everyone. That now that he's completed this cycle from the beginning to the end, The actual work in the middle, the bulk of it, the meat of it, done by these artists who actually told the stories, Stan took credit for all of it. I wrote it, I created it. And there's a difference between writing something and creating something. So what I'm getting at is I want to define before this video is over, what does a comic book creator do? Or what does a creator do? But we can scale it down to different media, but comic books is the one I'm homing in on, but it can apply to other things too. And I'm going to argue that I can tell you what a creator does because I'm a creator. It doesn't matter whether my work sucks or is brilliant, but I am a creator. I have been creating since I was a child. So I know the process. And fools like Frank Lovis are idiots. And what he said to me when I made the assertion that Jack Kirby created T'Challa, he said, "Bullshit, you simplistic Stan basher. There's more to a story than that. There's characterization and nuance, and without Stan Lee providing that, it wouldn't have been what it was." He's talking about writing individual stories, but he's conflating it with creating the characters, which is what I was talking about. If what Lovis claims is creation and follows on from Stan Lee's credit hogging over the decades, then let's look at my story real quick. Flicker Street. So I have hundreds of pages written, typed up, drawn up, different things. You've seen a lot of them on Facebook. You've seen some on here, heard about them. All done by me. I mean, some of the very early work was done in tandem with other people who inspired me. And then I kind of rearranged things because I wanted to kind of make it all my own. But there were definitely inspirations from friends who are talented, like Thomas Davis. And I've mentioned these people before, Christopher Pack, and unfortunately both of them are deceased now. But since the very end of the 80s, at the latest, I've been doing every element of this story. I've created every character, I've done every storyline all by myself. It's here and it's out there. So, what if I present that to a publisher or an editor, say a Stan Lee type, and he says, "Hey, true believer, I'm going to publish Flicker Street, man." And so he takes my, I've done layouts and breakdowns, kind of Marvel style for myself on my comic book story that was published, the only one I've had published, called Snow Leopard, published in 2011 by the Comic Book Artists Guild. And I laid out the whole thing visually, and then the talented penciler and inkers, Albie and Alex, they brought it to life. And then I laid the words on top of it. I kind of knew what the characters were going to say, but then I laid the words, and Shanti, my editor and collaborator on the project, as far as inking my work and painting the cover and stuff like that, she lettered it using my dialogue that I wrote. So I kind of experimented. That's kind of how I do lay out comic book stories. I did one called Conclaves that never got off the ground, a web comic, but I did a few issues and I laid them all out. I drew out all the panels, and they were loose. They weren't super loose and like Harvey Kurtzman, but I mean I don't have his talent at motion either through stick figures like he does. He's incredible. He was incredible layout artist. I don't have Kirby's imagination for layout, but I'm okay at it. I got better. I was influenced by people like that growing up, and then of course I was influenced by anime. By manga. And the story that I did, Snow Leopard, was for an American manga style anthology called With Honor. So I know both sides of it. I've done the work. I'm not saying I've had much of it published. I'm not saying I'm famous. I'm not saying I'm brilliant. But I am saying I know it. Just because I'm an autodidact does not diminish my knowledge. Because I don't have a degree, from Parsons School of Art or don't have an assignment at Marvel Comics, that doesn't mean that I don't know how to create comic books. Uh, I know that better than most crafts that I've ever been exposed to. Um, so, because it's the one I've toiled with and toyed with and ventured into the longest, more than I have music or just solid, just writing prose, etc., or song lyrics or whatever music. So, so say this snake oil charmer publisher says we're going to publish Flicker Street, uh, and then I get ripped off, right? His company somehow buys it from me. Maybe he gives me $100, like Siegel and Schuster. Maybe I get swindled or hornswoggled. Like he makes some kind of deal with me, like I'm going to be rich, or it's going to be sold off and made into an incredible miniseries on Showtime where I'll have creative control. So, say I'm foolish enough to do this, and then that editor, publisher, what have you, the boss man, the PR guy of the company, he goes in and he takes all these layouts I've drawn with dialogues, penciled in on the side. I mean, I keep full scripts too alongside them, and I do them simultaneously. It's a synergy. It's kind of a back and forth thing the way I do my comics. And I think it's pretty well done, but it makes me sad that I've been so lazy and unproductive at it. That's all on me. That's my bad. Life and mental illness and other tragedies have waylaid me, but I take responsibility for that. So, say I turn over this plot. I've got all the plots written down for years and years of stories. I've drawn out and laid out these issues where people do such and such. I've described the characters. I've designed the characters. I've drawn what they look like, what they wear, their costume. I've named the characters. It's my world. And say this cat comes in and once he gets hold of leverage against me legally, he goes in and writes dialogue all over it. What he thinks those characters should be saying. Okay, do you get my point? Who then created Flicker Street? Me or the snake oil salesman guy? Who wrote it? I determined every action that transpired. Every character came from my brain. So, who was the storyteller and who was the creator? It was not this, fictional flim flam guy I'm making up. Um, it was me. God damn it. Uh, so Frank Levis, by his logic of what a creator is a cat like this funky flashman kind of guy that I'm describing could come in and just write and add his characterization and nuance that without which it could not come to life. Uh, and then that means he created that doesn't just mean he wrote my stories, he created my characters. I've been waiting years to tell this guy off about this. I'll never get the chance. I blocked him, and his wife, who, like I said, I'd gotten lost, she blocked me too as a result. I guess she disappeared from my feed, and I didn't want to push the issue. I let him verbally assault me, and I didn't answer because he's Don's friend, and I love Don, and I respect Don, and I don't want to he's got enough stress in his life and health issues, and I don't want to add stress to him. I mean, he's brought people too much joy. He doesn't deserve that. He's a good man. He doesn't. I mean, a guy like Frank Levis doesn't deserve a friend like that. He doesn't really deserve any friends, but he doesn't deserve a friend like that. So he should count himself lucky, and I'm sure he does. Um, so my thing is, his argument is irrelevant and beyond moronic. But there are a lot of people who subscribe to it, and they use Stan Lee as their template. And I didn't realize this stuff when I was a kid. I told you how I perceived it. I perceived it much as Stan Lee extolled the details of it to us as children in the 70s, my generation. And a lot of those things he said were lies, or at least exaggerations, distortions, uh, And like I said, some of this came out in court with the Kirby suit. Many people have been unhappy with Stan Lee over the years. Wally Wood, Steve Ditko, Gene Colan have all said, they wrote the stories in the sense that they made what happened happen and they designed the characters. And in many cases, they named the characters. Sometimes you have a character like Daredevil. Martin Goodman says, him and Stan Lee are conferring, and they're like, Lev Gleason isn't publishing Daredevil anymore, and that copyright's expiring. Because there was a Daredevil superhero in the 40s. Why don't we make a Daredevil? So Stan Lee's got a name, Daredevil. And he says, okay, well, that's cool. First thing he wants is Jack Kirby to design it. So Jack Kirby comes up with the red and yellow costume with the double D's. No, I don't mean he's a woman with a bra. He's got two D's crisscrossing, and he's got the billy club, and he's horns, and he's leaping. Jack Kirby created that because it came out of his head. Just because Stan Lee asked him to do it doesn't mean Stan Lee did it. There's a difference. And then who fleshed out the storyline? Well, probably Bill Everett. Bill Everett was a writer in his own right. He wrote Andrew and created the Submariner, one of the classic superheroes of all time and one of the first superheroes of all time. And he also wrote and drew Venus and Marvel Boy. He didn't create Marvel Boy, but he created Venus. And he did tons of comics all through the Golden Age. And Stan Lee was smart to get him in Marvel on the ground floor because after he worked on Daredevil, he went on to do very strong runs on the Hulk and on Doctor Strange and then back to Submariner. God, he had all the Defenders lined up there. And great work all the way to the end. And again, some of his dialogue was considered, when they let him write it, it was kind of hokey. It wasn't like, when Roy Thomas wrote it. It wasn't that, didn't have the characterization. Well, it was his fucking character, man. And he was telling his story his way. And people who read comic books and had that attitude and still have that narrow bourgeoisie attitude, they haven't experienced much art, have they? They don't really know about art that isn't like totally linear, totally realistic, as though anything in Marvel Comics or any superhero comic book is truly realistic. The closest Marvel's come to being realistic is in these movies. But even there, the seed is not from. Some of the seed is there from the dialogue pushers and polishers and editors like Stan Lee, no doubt. The energy, the vibe, the hype part of the Marvel movies is Stan Lee all the way. That's why he's in the movies. He's they're an ad for him, and he's an ad for them. It's commerce. It's some art, but it's a lot of commerce more than art. But the concepts that flow through those movies, those came from Jack Kirby's brain and Steve Ditko's and Bill Everett's, Wally Wood's. The Daredevil series, all the Netflix Marvel series listed all the creators in every issue at the end. Like in the end of every episode, they would list all the creators who had work adapted in that episode or a character created that was used in that episode. And they were very good at that. And in the beginning of the episodes, they would credit the original co-creators and writers. Now, Roy Thomas was a writer, but he was a writer. He did create characters on his own. He may not have designed them visually, but he had ideas. I'm not saying Stan Lee didn't either, but Roy's got a lot more to show for it than Stan Lee. Just saying Roy Thomas. In other words, if Roy Thomas comes up with a concept for the son of Satan, well, actually, Stan Lee came up with the original concept. Let's do a comic book about Satan, the mark of Satan. So Roy Thomas changes it to son of Satan. Roy Thomas makes him the modern Ghost Rider and makes him a motorcyclist, supernatural. He creates Iron Fist because he went to see Five Fingers of Death and the ritual of the Iron Fist, and he wanted to have another kung fu star like Shang-Chi. He creates Luke Cage because he wanted a black superhero that was street level. Um, he creates Thundra because he wants a powerful Amazonian female character. You know, DC had Wonder Woman. Thundra should have been that big. Thunder, and he creates the Valkyrie, also similar kind of character. I could go on, but those could mostly Warlock, which is based off a Kirby character, him. But he could have come up with all those characters and got other artists than the original ones to do it, and the characters may have looked different, but the essence of the characters would still be there. So, you know, but those artists who realize them visually, like John Romita designed a lot of these characters. He drew their costume and their features and their face. He created, in that sense, John Romita created Luke Cage. He co-created Luke Cage with Roy Thomas, and then George Tuska and Billy Graham. They did the art for the first few issues, and they designed some of the incidental characters. So they had a hand in that. So all four of those men. Well, I don't know about Billy Graham, but Roy Thomas, John Romita, and George Tuska are all credited on the Luke Cage TV series. Roy Thomas and Gil Kane are credited on the Iron Fist TV series. Now, in Daredevil, it's credited to Stan Lee and Bill Everett because they were the original team. But Bill Everett only did one issue. But what he may have contributed is it's mostly conjecture. But did he create Foggy Nelson and Karen Page? We know Stan Lee loved romance comics and wrote them or scripted them, whatever. And so creating Karen Page and Foggy Nelson and the little love triangle with Matt and Murdoch, probably Stan's idea. Some people argue the alliterative names are a mark of Stan Lee, and he always said it was because he couldn't remember the names, so he made them alliterative in order to remember them. So hence Peter Parker, Scott Summers, Bruce Banner, Matt Murdock, Reed Richards, and on and so on. So you would think Matt Murdock was the name he came up with. And it could have been. But then again, Kirby also did alliterative character names going back to the Golden Age. Stan Lee may have popularized it and taken credit for it, but did he originate it? Did he do it? Jack Kirby could have named him Matt Murdock. It's hard to say. It's hard to say, you know. But the bottom line is, probably the strongest idea that Stan Lee probably had was him being blind, and that I believe that was his idea, though it could have been Bill Everett's. And the first issue not only had a cover by Kirby, as his design of Daredevil on the cover with inks by Bill Everett, but inside the art was by Bill Everett, who was great at inking his own work. He was a full, well-rounded artist, writer and artist. He was a one-man band. And he laid out the story. Stan acknowledged that. So a lot of the stuff with young Matt, after being struck with the vial of radiation and getting blinded and developing the radar sense, his father dying, being a boxer and dying, that could have all been made up by Bill Everett. And Stan Lee, put the characterization and nuance on it afterwards. And you could tell his dialogue or his captions were different than Bill Everett's. But Bill Everett might also, like Kirby, I don't know, I haven't seen the stats of those. Might have also scribbled in some ideas for dialogue. Who knows? It becomes a collaborative suit by this time. And they needed to get the issue out, so all of the backgrounds that Bill Everett drew, he didn't ink the backgrounds. He only inked the figures. Steve Ditko came in and inked the background. So I don't think Steve Ditko created any part of Daredevil, but it's interesting because the red and yellow design by Kirby and where the red and yellow lands on the body, on the costume. Because Steve Ditko took that pattern and redesigned Iron Man. The original golden armor, gray armor, and then golden armor Iron Man, the clunky one, which you also see in the first movie, Jack Kirby designed that. Okay, so when they redid him with the more sleek gold and red armor, Steve Ditko created that armor. He designed all of it. And so I think he took, personally, I think he took the color idea from Daredevil. Synergy, they were supposed to be a group, Marvel Comics group. Now, mind you, in all this, take note that I'm not diminishing the fact Stanley edited the stories or published and hyped the stories and promoted them. I'm not denying that Stanley put the final script touches on the stories and captions on the covers, almost certainly. But a lot of the dialogue was not written by him. The vast majority of the plot lines were not written by him. And the vast majority of the actual creation was not done by him. So I would put him as a co-creator of several of the characters, but I would put him second. I would put Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, not the other way around, simply because Stan Lee was his boss, or simply because the writer's supposed to come before the artist. And again, you're confusing what is a creator, what is a storyteller. And comics used to be an assembly line process. Things like inking have gone the way of the dinosaur, much to the chagrin of like the Inkwell Awards, who I used to work for, volunteer, trying to preserve the idea of distinctive inkers working over pencilers, and that being an art form of its own. I accept that because I respect the traditional stuff, but then again, I believe an artist is an artist. I may want to ink my own art. I may want to keep it pencils. I may want to paint it. Bill Sienkiewicz doesn't have an inker. He's been an inker because he's excellent at accentuating. Uh, but you know, most artists that are fully realized have not needed inkers for quite a long time because they have more time to finish the books. It's not an assembly line process like it was developed in the late 30s and the 1940s. Look at EC Comics, though. The early 1950s, and we're talking about monthly comic books. You'd have like five-page stories each issue, or four. And they were done full script. And the scripting was great in every way. A little melodramatic at times, but overly florid, but good literature to great literature, great ideas. I mean, influenced the Twilight Zone, and all those shows and properties since then. And those EC Comics, those guys didn't have inkers. Wally Wood drew it and he inked it. So did George Evans and Al Williamson, Jack Davis and Johnny Craig, Graham Ingalls, Jack Kamen. We go on and on with these brilliant people. Al Feldstein. Frank Frazetta worked for EC for a while. None of them had inkers. So, how were they able to churn out work of that high level? And the art was brilliant. How were they able to churn out that high level of quality? I think it's because the work environment was encouraging, because Gaines did do a lot of the writing himself, and he did promote the book, and the stuff he did to promote it and make buddies with the readers. Stan took all that and did it with Marvel. Those were all William Gaines's ideas and contributions to the history of comics fandom, not Stan Lee's. Stan Lee made them bigger corporate, bigger audience, more millions of people. I mean, EC sold like crazy, but still mostly to kids. And I mean, they did sell a lot. They were big, but they were taken down by the censors, by Senator Kefauver and the Comics Code Authority and Frederick Wortham and those maniacs. McCarthyism. We're in neo-McCarthyism now. That was the McCarthyism. Killed EC for the most part, and emasculated it because they were adult comic books. They were for adults, really. I mean, that's probably why they were so gory and had some lurid sexual undertones. They didn't have any nudity, they didn't have any cursing, but they were mature and they read well today. To me, there's never been a project like EC Comics, so that's why it's my favorite comic company of all time, because there was 3, 4, maybe 5 years of unparalleled genius on every level, uh, and it wasn't like what Will Eisner said about his work in comic books. He's like, well, I was kind of an inept writer and an inept artist. So I put them together and I created ineptitude. Well, he's being hard on himself. Obviously, he was one of the most influential comic creators of all time. Uh, but the EC people, they weren't inept. They took a writer with great aptitude and an artist with great aptitude, and the two of them did it. And then they had Marie Severin coloring the whole line, whose brother John Severin was a key artist also. Another brilliant. Now, of course, several of these people, Wallace Wood, Marie Severin, John Severin, they all went over to Marvel in the 1960s. Johnny Craig briefly. Um, whereas Jack Davis went into commercial art and made a fortune. And that's how I first saw his art as a kid, covers of TV Guide magazine and cereal boxes. Um, so, EC was able to do that. At Marvel, though, they were still banging him out, and Stan Lee was stretching himself thin, and Martin Goodman was on his ass. But Stan Lee wanted to be famous. I think he always did. He had a gregarious personality. He had a likable personality, and I think he was kind of a narcissist. And uh, Kirby to me was an artist. He was a guy. If you sat him in the corner alone, not paying him, not telling him what to do, not giving him any incentive, he'd still be drawing. He'd still be creating characters. But the fact that he did it so feverishly, Stan Lee exploited that, and I understand why. I mean, he had an assembly line, and he did get inkers to work on Kirby, and a lot of them made Kirby's work just kind of suck at times. But later he would get complimentary inkers because he didn't have time or inclination to ink it himself, though he easily could. He's done paintings, which are just pen and ink drawings that he painted in color, and they've been in museums. I mean, they're cosmic and amazing. He did the original Lord of Light illustrations for the aborted Lord of Light film, which was a cover for a CIA operation, and that whole thing was fictionalized in Ben Affleck's film Argo, and Michael Parks played Jack Kirby. So, I hope you understand what I'm trying to say about what a creator does, what a comic book creator does. What's the difference between a creator and a writer, the difference between a creator and a storyteller, and the difference between a scripter / editor and a writer. If the editor comes in and takes your dialogue and paraphrases it and cleans it up, he may add some witticisms that catch on with readers because he's, a guy like Stan Lee. He had a great vocabulary. He was very well read. But so was Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby just wasn't a show off with language like Stan Lee was. Jack Kirby wasn't a huckster, and I'm not knocking Stan for being a huckster. I'm glad he made Marvel famous. I'm glad we have him. I'm glad we have these movies, but people need to give credit where credit is due and not be so oversensitive like this Frank Lovis clown and these people I'm seeing on these groups every day on Facebook that I rarely read the notifications anymore. I've started just quitting them one by one because it's a bunch of angry baby boomers and a few angry Gen Xers who they don't want to grow. They don't want to look at things outside the box. They don't want to. They're not artists, so they don't know what an artist does. They're not creators, so they don't know what a creator does. And I will tell you, I know what a creator does. I am a creator. And there's not any indication of the quality of creation. It's just I know it. It's a process. It's a gift. It's whatever you want to call it. A talent, inspiration, epiphany, channeling something. Like my stories write themselves. That's a cliche, but mine kind of do, and the best ones always have. When I've had to devise and contrive, I've usually come up with crap, and I've usually fixed it later or aborted it altogether. If it doesn't flow for me, I usually don't put it on the paper. And I don't make it canonical within my, Flickr Street universe. So now people have a luxury of being writers, artists, of being overall creators, of being pencilers, inkers, of, doing their own dialogue. There's not this assembly line need anymore. You don't need scripters over writers. You don't need inkers over artists. Those were purely mechanical functions of an industrialized business model. Not saying there wasn't creativity in them. I'm not saying that, say, Joe Sinnott's inking wasn't artistic. I'm not saying some of Stan Lee's, Shakespearean paraphrasing of Kirby's dialogue wasn't pleasing to the ear. It was. Some of it's a little hokey now, though, I admit. But some of it is powerful and very memorable. And a lot of people's argument then comes down to, well, you couldn't have one without the other. So that's the final part of my argument. Y'all are probably relieved. Stan Lee, after breaking with Kirby, didn't create anything of consequence. Not one memorable character. The only memorable characters he created, as in he wrote the first issue of their stories, and again, they were laid out and plotted by the artists, were ones that were done to cash in on another character, done to avoid a copyright hassle. She-Hulk, Ms. Marvel, who eventually became the character Captain Marvel. The last major character that Stan Lee wrote, created for Marvel was Captain Marvel. And again, it was just like Daredevil. We had this huge character, Captain Marvel, from Fawcett Comics. Sold millions in the 50s, outsold Superman, and then DC sued him and knocked him down. Just the way those fucking censors knocked down Gaines and EC. Jealousy, man. Greed. And so Captain Marvel's laying around. It's like either Martin Goodman and or Stan Lee said, we're Marvel. Captain Marvel's available. Let's make our Captain Marvel. And they trademarked it, and now DC can't use the name of the character, which they took the rights from Fawcett after running them out of business. So Fawcett got screwed the worst. Then DC got screwed by Marvel. It's also karmic. But anyway, Stan Lee, he and Gene Colan co-created the Captain Marvel series with Marvel, the Kree and that whole plot line. And I talked about some of that stuff in a recent video, so I won't bore you again. But I loved Marvel. I liked the nobility of the idea, and I think Stan Lee did have a lot of those ideas. He was obviously influenced by a lot of old science fiction movies from the 50s. But Kirby had always been influenced by movies, all kinds of movies. His work was cinematic. Stan Lee tried to be more urbane and literate, but at the same time hip and youth oriented. And it did catch on with people young enough to be his children. Somehow he found a voice for Peter Parker, but he didn't create that. He didn't create Peter Parker's persona. Steve Ditko did. And of course, people are going to fight about that to the end of time, too. I could go through Spider-Man point by point the way I did Daredevil and Captain Marvel and tons of other characters. But his is more complicated and drawn out because he's a more famous character. More people have written on, and there's more controversy because of his fame. I will say about Doctor Strange, Stan Lee slipped up in an interview in the mid-'60s and said, they were like, where'd this Doctor Strange cat come from? Paraphrasing. And Stan Lee said, it was all Steve's idea, Steve Ditko. The name Doctor Strange had already been used by Stan Lee for a villain for some throwaway issue of a comic. Tales of Suspense. But there was a character in the 50s called Doc Strange, who was later kind of rebooted by Alan Moore as I think there was Tom Strange, and then there was some Tom Strong and Doc Strange, but it was a takeoff on Doc Strange. They looked the same. They were in Alan Moore's America's Best Comics line for Wildstorm, and I think that Doc Strange morphed into Doctor Strange, and they had the name laying around, just like they had the name Daredevil, the name Captain Marvel. They're like pulling out of the air from other people, and Spider-Man was a name that probably was not created by Stan Lee either. It's a very good chance it actually was created by Jack Kirby, the name. So Doctor Strange, obviously, then Ditko, his claims that he designed the character, his visuals, his origin, his adventures, his other dimensional, all of that was from Steve Ditko's brain. And Steve Ditko tended to ink his own work as well, at least on Doctor Strange, more so than on other books. Um, Steve Ditko lived in that world, man. That world came out of his brain. And Steve Ditko has done wild mind fucks since then. Not as good, not as popular or maybe as sharp as Doctor Strange, but I mean, he's done Shade the Changing Man. That alone, geez. I mean, there's tons of stuff he's done, over the years. And a lot of it's this weird objectivism stuff with Mr. A and the Question, but he's never stopped creating. I mean, he was drawing comics till he fucking died, and he would have them published by anybody, nobody publishers or indie publishers that had a big reputation, like Fantagraphics published a lot of his later work because they recognized, he's a true artist, he was a true auteur, and mind you, he was writing his own dialogue on all these stories. He was doing all the way back to the 70s. He was doing horror stories, writing and drawing them for Creepy and Eerie, really wild, crazy stuff, and he had an amazing, distinctive style. Doctor Strange is right up his, in his wheelhouse. And I think one reason Spider-Man was clicked was so idiosyncratic was because of Ditko. Because try to apply that weird, outre way of looking at the world and put it into a mainstream superhero, and then make it a neurotic teenager, and then you've got brilliance. And again, Stan Lee, he worked it up and he popularized it, and it became much bigger when Romita drew it. This art was slicker. I like Romita's art. It's just a different animal, and I do think Stan came up with a lot of the plots and wrote quite a lot of the dialogue. But Romita has also claimed that he came up with a lot of the plots and drew them independent of Stan, and then Stan just put dialogue on them. So the only holdout that says all this isn't true is Roy Thomas. And I know Roy Thomas personally. I haven't seen him in a few years. I love the guy. I mean, it's not like we're good buddies, but I mean, we've met many times. We've had long conversations. I've interviewed him. We posted pictures together at conventions. He signed my books. We've traded books as friends, and I get it. Stan Lee made his career. But the thing is, Roy Thomas actually became what Stan Lee kind of purported to be, but wasn't wholly. And I don't think Roy wants to own that. He's too humble and he's too loyal to his friend who has passed away and who gave him opportunity. And so he's going to maybe belittle these claims made by people like Ditko, Kirby, Wood, Colin, etc. So that's where I'm at. Who created what and blah blah blah. But essentially, what is a creator, and what is a comic book creator? Uh, it's someone who creates the actual stories, someone who tells the stories, is someone who draws the characters, who makes them come to life visually because it's a visual medium. It's someone who usually names the characters, usually has the premise for the character, but not always. Again, there can be collaboration, but I don't think anyone should make a mistake and think that the really big iconic Marvel characters that we're seeing in these movies, the vast majority of the things we love about them were created by two guys, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, and then a few other guys here and there, like Daredevil with Netflix with Bill Everett, and then a few exceptions here and there. Don Heck helped create Iron Man. Larry Lieber gets a credit on Iron Man now because he created the name Tony Stark and he wrote a lot of the stories. Larry Lieber wrote a lot of the scripts that Stan Lee took credit for on the early Ant-Mans, the early Thors, early Iron Mans. They were brothers, and Larry also, he drew a lot of the stuff. He drew a lot of the early Thors. It was a very different kind of comic then. When Kirby kind of took charge of it, it took off and went into this whole mythological thing, full tilt, kind of 20th century space age Norse mythology. And that's been translated into the films fairly well, I think. So the final anecdote that I get back to earlier, why did Kirby pick Captain America and Black Panther? First of all, Kirby created Captain America with Joe Simon. From what I've been able to gather, Jack Kirby did the majority of the work, but Joe Simon did ink it and help write the dialogue. The actual origin story, they may have bounced ideas around together. Maybe Joe Simon created some elements. Who knows? I believe personally, I don't, I can't prove it, but from what I've read and what I believe is that Jack Kirby created the name Captain America and the name Steve Rogers and the super soldier idea. But I do believe Joe Simon added a lot of nuance to it that he doesn't get credit for. And on the movies, it's created by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. There, Jack Kirby's name comes first because not many people know who Joe Simon is anymore. So Kirby wanted his character back, and they let him write it and do whatever. Why not? He did have leverage. I mean, he wasn't going to sue them, but you never know. Black Panther. I think he created Black Panther by himself. I think he came up with T'Challa because there's tons of documentation of him having an idea for a first black superhero, and he was originally called the Coal Tiger, and then he was redesigned, but he was always a black man. And finally, the Silver Surfer. Stan Lee has always said that Jack Kirby came up with the Silver Surfer completely by himself, designed the character, named the character, gave him cosmic powers, made him the Herald of Galactus. Stan Lee had created Galactus, or co-created with Kirby. It's really a very Kirby-ish character, but be that as it may, Stan Lee intended Galactus to be in that first story, first Galactus little arc in Fantastic Four. And Kirby just tossed Silver Surfer in there, and Stan Lee fell in love with Silver Surfer and wanted to write him for years, and did some of his better dialogue on Silver Surfer and his more, poetic stuff. And it became a cult thing, But the only reason Kirby was able to throw Silver Surfer in the middle of a story was he was already laying out every issue, the whole plot. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He made it happen on paper. So he was the storyteller. So essentially, he was the writer. And then Stan Lee got it and went, "Whoa, who's Silver Surfer? What's going on here?" Okay, and I got to think of some word balloons for all these people to say, which might have seemed novel at the time, a way of working the Marvel method. But really, it was, like I've said before, it was a matter of necessity, a business model, an industrial, what do you call it? When people in factory mass, my brain's gone blank. But you know what I mean. We have an assembly line. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. Assembly line. One person's putting the nuts on the thing, and one person's putting the bolts, and that's essentially what it was. So comics aren't like that anymore, and comics at their best have never been like that. Though some great comics have come out of that. It's all kind of a continuum, man. It's all constantly growing, flowing, changing, and yeah. So that's what a creator does. And that's specifically what a comic book creator does. A comic book character creator does too, and a storyteller and a writer, as opposed to a stenographer, a dialoguist, an editor, a scripter. That's its own beast. So I'm gonna go. I think now this is might be my longest video. It might break the Breaking Bad video, but I had a lot to say. I'm pleased with the way I said it. You guys may not be. You may disagree with some of these points, but I can back up this stuff pretty heavy. I've I'm an autodidact, and I've been teaching myself about comics since I was like 2 years old. So, and I've worked in comics, albeit briefly, and I've reviewed comics professionally, and I've graded, appraised, and sold comic books as a dealer, and now I'm dealing them on eBay. So I know comics, and the bitter Ebenezer Scrooge-like bah humbug folk of the world like Frank Levis, they're irrelevant in this. So yeah, that's what a creator does, Frank. Get it straight. All right, take care.